线长山又高，处处港口都险要。
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Straight Talk with Xiangyu, where we dive deep into the Taiwan Strait and explore perspectives of everything Taiwan related, not typically found on Western mainstream media. Before we begin, I got an announcement to make, which is I am starting to turn some of the episodes into article form, since I know sometimes these long-winded rants are packed with a lot of information and can be a little bit hard to keep up with. I'll also try to be a little bit more proactive in creating clips, and I think I'll be doing more of that once I finish my album, which is over halfway completed. Anyways, the stuff I'll be covering in this episode is also available in article form, which is linked in the show notes, so if you think that might be helpful, be sure to take a look down below. And if you subscribe to my Substack, you'll automatically receive all future articles in your email, so please give that a consideration. Now, on to the main show. What if I told you that there is one event in Taiwan's history that both pro and anti-China people in the West get completely wrong, with even the pro-China side unintentionally repeating lies spread by Taiwan separatists for their political gains? Let me pull up a passage from William Bloom's book, Killing Hope. The late William Bloom is a great author whom I greatly respect, who wrote some great books teaching the basics about U.S. imperialism and anti-communism, but even someone as well-studied as him unintentionally repeated lies spread by Taiwan separatists. On page 22 of his book, Killing Hope, he wrote, "The Generalismo," so Chiang Kai-shek, "his cohorts and soldiers fled to the offshore island of Taiwan. They had prepared their entry 2 years earlier by terrorizing the islanders into submission, a massacre which took the lives of as many as 28,000 people." He is talking, of course, about the February 28th incident, which is more commonly known over here in Taiwan as the 228 incident, 228事件, which was indeed a tragedy in our history, but far from the simple matter of the KMT massacring the people on Taiwan in order to terrorize them into submission in preparation for his retreat 2 years later. So let's go over how the 228 incident is oftentimes summarized. The version of events you'll likely hear is, on February 27th, 1947, a woman selling untaxed cigarettes got the cigarettes that she was selling confiscated by an enforcement team from the Tobacco Monopoly Bureau, which resulted in an altercation. The cigarette vendor was beaten, so angry protesters protested the government the next day on February 28th. Soldiers shot into the crowd of protesters, and then more soldiers were sent to Taiwan to begin slaughtering Taiwanese people left and right indiscriminately, killing tens of thousands of innocent people. And then, after this massacre, the KMT banned discussion about this event for decades. The only problem is, this was not at all how it happened. I'll explain in detail what happened, but before we do that, I have to give more background information so everyone can fully understand what went on. Now, before I get into the fine details, I do want to dispel one very common misunderstanding of this event by many pro-China Westerners. If we take my summary of the popular narrative at its face value, then you'd be right to believe that 228 was a massacre of a bunch of Taiwanese people by KMT soldiers from the Chinese mainland. Now, further complicating this is the way different groups of people are translated into English. I'll give an example once again from William Bloom's Killing Hope. In the appendix, he writes, in 1992, the Taiwan government admitted that its army had killed an estimated 18,000 to 28,000 native-born Taiwanese in the 1947 massacre. And this was cited from a newspaper article from the February 24th issue of the LA Times from 1992. Given this phrasing, native-born Taiwanese, which is often also translated as native Taiwanese in English language media, combined with the idea that the 228 incident was a massacre of as many as 28,000 people done by the KMT, now all of a sudden, you have even pro-China Westerners spreading misinformation about this event because in their minds, they now believe that this incident was an act of genocide against Taiwan's indigenous population, since the term 本省人 was translated into native Taiwanese. If nobody explained to you the demographics of Taiwan, then given this wording, it sounds a lot like genocide against indigenous people in Taiwan, right? And then you look at the fact that Taiwan's population is roughly 98% Han and 2% indigenous today. You might start thinking that Taiwan became Han majority because of genocidal actions carried out by the KMT. And so we get memes like this one from Western communists. This guy's like, never ask a woman her age, a man his salary, or what the Republic of China was doing to the natives in Taiwan. I tried to correct him, but this retard just kind of doubled down, so fuck him. But the only problem is, for all of the KMT's faults and the crimes it committed during the era of White Terror, genocide was actually not one of them. The process of Taiwan becoming majority Han occurred over the Ming and Qing dynasties, long before there ever was a KMT, so Taiwan's population was already majority Han by the time the KMT arrived. If you look at historical population data, you'll find that the indigenous population of Taiwan did not ever experience a decrease that you'd see if a genocide had in fact occurred. Indigenous people were not involved at all as a group during the 228 incident. I repeat, indigenous people as a group were not involved in the 228 incident. Could there have been individuals who happened to be indigenous caught up in the tragedy? Probably, but they were not targeted for being indigenous. Most of the chaos during the incident occurred in urban areas of Taiwan, while the indigenous population lived mostly in the rural areas of Taiwan's mountainous and remote regions, meaning their communities were not really affected at all by the 228 incident. So we cannot describe the 228 incident as a genocide against the island's indigenous population. So now you'll ask, why do articles about the 228 incident bring up native Taiwanese? In this context, think of the word native the way someone born and raised in New York City from a family that's been in New York City for generations might call themselves a New York native, whereas some yuppie from Georgia moving to the city would be a transplant and not a native. So I'm going to briefly go over Taiwan's population makeup because it's very relevant for understanding the 228 incident. So broadly, you have the Han people and the indigenous population. Over here in Taiwan, the indigenous people are referred to as 原住民, which means like the original inhabitants, whereas Beijing refers to them as 高山族, which means like the high mountain nation, because they inhabit the mountainous regions of Taiwan. When Beijing says there are 56 nations in China and 55 of them being minority nations, 高山族is one of the 55. And I want to remind people that nation is not synonymous with country or state, but refers to a group of people sharing a common language, land, culture, history, and group consciousness. It just so happens that modern states in the West emerged as nation states, so in English we use the terms synonymously, even though that's actually incorrect. Now, there is a concept of a Chinese nation today because all 56 Chinese nations do share a common language, standard Mandarin, and also have a shared culture, history, and consciousness and all that. So we can really describe the Chinese nation as a family of 56 nations or sub-nations, with the Han people being the majority. Anyways, in Taiwan, Han people make up 98% of the population and the indigenous make up roughly 2%. Other sources have it closer to 95 and 5, but the point is, by the time the KMT arrived, the indigenous population was already in the minority. Also noteworthy is that some Han people in Taiwan are in fact Aboriginal people in the plains areas who've long been assimilated into Han culture over generations of contact and trade. Now, the Han population can broadly be divided into what's called 本省人 and 外省人. 本省人 means people from this province, and 外省人 means like extra provincial people or people from other provinces, so basically meaning the mainland. If your family had already established roots in Taiwan by 1945, when Taiwan was returned to China, you are a 本省人. If your family arrived to the island after 1945, all the way up to, I'd say, the mid-1950s, then you're a 外省人. Most 外省人arrived in 1949 because of history. Now, if you are a mainlander who grew up under communist rule and live on the mainland, you'd just be called 大陆人, which simply just means mainlander. If you're a 大陆人and you move to Taiwan, you'd still be a 大陆人because in Taiwan's context, 外省人 refers to mainlanders from that specific era of migration. And today, around 20% of Taiwan's Han population is 外省人and 80% is 本省人. Though the lines are very blurred because many intermarriages between these groups have happened over the last few generations. But in the past, whether you were 本省人 or 外省人 meant a bit more in Taiwan society. I find that a lot of people have this idea that the majority of Taiwan's population comes from the 1949 exodus from the mainland, but that's actually far from the truth. However, 外省人 did make up the majority of government beyond the local level in Taiwan until democratization. So in a sense, even though the majority of the population is Han and the majority of the government was also Han, it was in a sense minority rule over a majority if we look at it from the 外省人 versus 本省人 angle. 外省人 came from a bunch of different provinces, while 本省人 can be subdivided into Hoklo and Hakka. The majority of 本省人 are Hoklo, which means their ancestors arrived from southern Fujian, mainly from Zhangzhou and Quanzhou, and Hakka people came mostly from the Hakka regions of Guangdong. The way that Taiwan separatists like to frame the 228 incident is that it was the indiscriminate massacre of 本省人, so local Taiwanese, by a bunch of KMT soldiers, so 外省人. However, this version of events is almost just as ridiculous as the version where it was apparently a bunch of Han people carrying out genocide against Taiwan's indigenous population. So what are the factors that led to the 228 incident and what actually happened? To understand this, we have to go back to 1945, and I will divide the story into 4 waves of killing. The first wave was the initial incident that led to the wrongful death of a bystander and erupted the initial protests. The second wave was the protests evolving into a state of anarchy where local Taiwanese lumpen proletariat, so 本省人, began indiscriminately beating, murdering, and even raping people who happened to come from the mainland. This is the part that is sanitized and downplayed today to sell a certain narrative. Then the third wave was the arrival of reinforcements from the mainland who went on to violently suppress the state of anarchy. Then finally, after the initial suppression, the fourth wave occurred when bad actors among the population in Taiwan began leading on soldiers from the mainland to kill other Taiwanese people, essentially getting soldiers to help them settle personal scores by making false accusations. For those who've been watching the show, you'll know that in 1945, Taiwan was returned by Japan to China following Japan's defeat in World War II. Taiwan became a Japanese colony in 1895 after China lost the First Sino-Japanese War. So for those who try to argue that Taiwan has never been a part of China ever, ask them why Japan had to defeat China and force China to cede Taiwan in order to colonize the island. So up to this point in Taiwan, nearly the entire population had roots in southern Fujian, or the Hakka areas of Guangdong. So the Han population was quite homogeneous, and everyone underwent 50 years of Japanese colonization unless they escaped to the mainland during that time like some did. Initially, with the exception of those who really stood to benefit from Japanese rule, everyone was excited about Taiwan being returned to the motherland and to finally live as Chinese citizens on what was once again Chinese soil. But once the KMT soldiers arrived in 1945, the situation began to change. So, after being separated from their mainland brothers and sisters for half a century, the first mainlanders they see are poorly dressed soldiers from the mainland who obviously came from much worse standards of living, so that first impression was quite disappointing for many. And a lot of these soldiers, unfortunately, were very poorly disciplined, and for a lack of a better term, many were country bumpkins who had never seen things like elevators before. And if you're a society that's more developmentally advanced, it's a bit of a shock when all of a sudden you're ruled by people who are products of a more developmentally backwards environment. Not to mention, whereas local Taiwanese spoke Hokkien or Hakka depending on their roots and where in Taiwan they grew up, these new people coming from the mainland mostly spoke other Chinese languages and dialects, because keep in mind, not enough time had passed yet for the existing population of Taiwan to become proficient at speaking standard Mandarin. Shortly after Taiwan's return to China, the civil war on the mainland between the KMT and the communists resumed. So properly governing Taiwan and rebuilding it was not exactly a priority by the government. And because the war was going on, the people in Taiwan were taxed heavily to support the war, all while inflation was skyrocketing. A lot of civil servants were sacked and replaced by underqualified mainlanders for a variety of reasons, such as the fact that the existing civil servants were educated under the Japanese educational system, and also distrust by the KMT over their loyalties, since many men in Taiwan were drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army towards the tail end of World War II. Of course, all of these factors are not properly explained by Taiwan separatists very often, who just like to boil it down to mainlanders looking down on Taiwanese people. And of course, mainlanders in Taiwan who happen to be from better off backgrounds did look down on some Taiwanese people, but many Taiwanese people also look down on poor mainlanders as backwards. And you won't hear about the latter part mentioned often by Taiwan separatists because they want to just play victim. Also keep in mind that although Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945, Taiwan was not returned to China until October 25th. And between August and October, the Japanese authorities engaged in deliberate acts of sabotage to diminish Taiwan's potential utility to the incoming Chinese administration. Their sabotage included the destruction of infrastructure, dismantling of industrial facilities, depletion of resources, destruction of records, and currency manipulation. As a result, Taiwan, which was already a war-torn island, was left in a state of further disrepair, significantly hampering its economic recovery in the early days of KMT rule and creating fertile ground for discontent towards the incoming KMT to take root. The point is, you have all of these factors. A local Taiwanese population initially looking forward to the island's return to China, only to be disappointed by how poorly the KMT ran things, all while the economy was going down the drain, and all at the hands of a government made up of mainlanders. So it's sad but understandable that there was this sentiment that the KMT is bad, the KMT is made up of mainlanders, therefore mainlanders are bad, and we don't like them. Basically, there was a whole lot of powder in the keg waiting to be ignited. And that's exactly what happened on February 28th, 1947. Or perhaps we should say February 27th, 1947. On this day, a tobacco monopoly bureau enforcement team in Taipei confiscated illegal cigarettes being sold by a woman named Lin Jiangmai. This led to an altercation, which was escalated when one of the members of the enforcement team struck her with his rifle. Passers-by intervened and surrounded the team, so one of the officers fired what was intended to be a warning shot to disperse the crowd. But that shot did end up hitting a bystander who died the next day. So this was the beginning of the first wave of killing. So a mainlander with the government firing his gun to disperse the crowd, accidentally hitting a bystander who died the next day. And so the enforcement team fled the scene and protests ensued. So the next day, like when the guy died, the people who saw what happened protested the Governor General's office and made demands such as the constitutional governance in Taiwan, the direct election for the provincial governor, and the establishment of a Chinese federation with provincial autonomy for Taiwan. In addition to calls for more Taiwanese representation in the provincial government of Taiwan, they also asked for officers involved in the initial altercation with the cigarette vendor to be publicly executed. So you can see, while the calls for more representation were reasonable, the call for the government to perform a public execution for the protesters is just not something that, quite frankly, any government would accept. And so the provincial government ignored the people, then soldiers fired into the crowd to disperse it, and apparently a few people died. What was a protest at first now became a riot, with many rioters taking over government buildings, military bases, and radio stations. And after they took over the radio stations, this news was broadcasted to the rest of the island, and the riots spread like wildfire. Now, this is the part that is heavily downplayed by the mainstream narrative regarding the 228 incident, which is the second wave of killing. From February 28th to March 8th, Taiwan was in a state of anarchy and rioters were out of control. Of course, the people in power, the KMT people, had protection, so rioters were not going to get to them. And so they began directing their anger at mainlanders in Taiwan who did not have these protections. So civil servants, teachers, shopkeepers, random civilians who happened to be mainlanders in Taiwan. And keep in mind, this was before 1949, so the number of mainlanders in Taiwan was a lot fewer than it became. Now, during this time, countless mainlanders were brutally beaten, murdered, and even raped by these hooligans. So yes, women were not spared either. And not only was this the case, there were also many documented instances of children from the mainland being murdered by local Taiwanese thugs. A lot of these lumpen proletariat were drafted by the Japanese into the war, and they returned to Taiwan facing unemployment and an uncertain future. And they were understandably very frustrated, but the fact remains that they dealt with their situation in a very destructive manner, going around beating, murdering, and even raping innocent people for over a week with no one stopping them. Remember, when the Japanese ruled Taiwan, Japan was a rich and industrialized empire, and after about 30 years of crushing anti-Japanese revolts, Japan's rule over Taiwan became very secure, and towards the end of its rule, it was carrying out a program to assimilate Taiwan's population into Japanese society. This process immediately ended in 1945, but for some whose formative years occurred during these years of encouraged assimilation, where if you successfully adopted full-on Japanese culture, you would have better opportunities in life, this created an impact, especially for those who were conscripted into the military on top of being heavily brainwashed by the Japanese. So, as you can guess, once the war ended and Taiwan was returned to China, some of these people felt this existential crisis, especially those who ended up unemployed and did not have a bright future ahead. All of a sudden, you have an incoming government that had spent the last 8 years fighting the Japanese, was poor, and was rife with problems. This added another layer of resentment towards mainlanders for lumpenproletariat Taiwanese who were indoctrinated by the Japanese. So 228 was like this huge revenge fantasy that came true for these people, and they used it as an opportunity to take their anger out on mainlanders. So how did these thugs determine whether you were Taiwanese? If they thought you were a mainlander, they'd ask you in Hokkien, "Where are you from?" "Ditoirang." And if you responded in broken Hokkien, like, "Wa Taiwan lang," "Wa Taiwan lang," it's supposed to be, "Wa shi Taiwan lang." Or if you just couldn't understand them at all and perhaps responded in Mandarin, like, 我是外省人, or 我是安徽人, 我是山东人, 我是北京人, they determine that you're a mainlander. Now, of course, there are Hokkien-speaking parts of the Chinese mainland, such as places like Xiamen or like Quanzhou, Zhangzhou. So, and if you happen to be one of them and they thought, your accent seems a bit different, what would they do then? Well, they had another trick up their sleeve, which is they would ask you, "Anta doko no hito ka?" Where are you from? So, "Anta doko no hito ka" is Japanese for where are you from, because if you were from a Hokkien-speaking part of the mainland, you would speak Hokkien, but because you weren't colonized by the Japanese, you would not be able to speak Japanese. And that's how they determine if you hadn't been colonized by the Japanese, you only recently arrived to Taiwan. To give a few examples of some of the brutality, there was a teacher in what is now Daxi district, which is in Taoyuan City. And because she was a mainlander, she was gang raped by local Taiwanese hooligans. There was also another incident involving a woman who was carrying a small child. So these thugs took her child and threw him or her into a ditch to his or her death. And then they proceeded to murder the mother. There's countless of other examples of these very terrible things happening. And because this is inconvenient for the separatist narrative, this part of the 228 incident is downplayed significantly by the media and school textbooks. So a lot of people in Taiwan don't even realize the full extent of these types of Taiwanese on mainlander crimes that happened. So why is it that this part of the 228 incident is hardly ever spoken about? It's because if they spoke of it as much as they speak about soldiers coming in to violently suppress the violence, all of a sudden the framing of 228 being the KMT slaughtering a bunch of innocent Taiwanese people falls apart. I'm not saying the soldiers from the mainland were right or that the local Taiwanese thugs were justified in their actions, but when you understand the real history of 228, all of a sudden it becomes very disgusting how this incident is used to sow division in Taiwan or to spread anti-mainland sentiments when there were victims from both groups as well as killers from both groups. At the end of the day, it's a painful tragedy that impacted people in Taiwan from all sorts of backgrounds. But because of how this part of the 228 incident has been downplayed, a lot of people in Taiwan today think it's just a bunch of angry but peaceful protesters made up of intellectuals expressing their anger towards the government who later got mowed down by the military. But what kind of peaceful intellectual goes around taking their anger towards the KMT on innocent people who happen to be from the mainland just because the KMT officials they were pissed at also happened to be mainlanders? You know, in the 1990s, after martial law was lifted, the executive body of the Taiwan administration formed a team to write a formal report on the 228 incident to be published for the public. This was during the leadership of Li Denghui, the first local Taiwanese leader of the Taiwan area. Curiously, when the report was being written, all of the recorded instances of mainlanders being brutally victimized by local Taiwanese were downplayed, while incidents of local Taiwanese being victims of mainlanders were amplified. From this report, there was a section on Taichung. Next to the names of victims were their hometowns, and there was one civil servant, his name was Liu Qingshan, whose hometown was curiously left blank. So let me tell you the story about Liu Qingshan. Basically, he was a civil servant and he was hiding in a hospital, and thugs found him hiding at the hospital, where they proceeded to mutilate him by digging out his eyes, cut off his ears, his nose, and then they left him to die. So why was his hometown left empty? Because this man was from Anhui province on the mainland. This was no secret, but his hometown was conveniently left out to sell the story that 228 was a bunch of mainlanders killing a bunch of Taiwanese. But you look at this brutal incident, it's the complete opposite. It's this civil servant from the mainland getting brutally mutilated by local Taiwanese thugs. So this is why in William Bloom's book, he mistakenly frames the incident as the KMT terrorizing the people on the island for no apparent reason other than to prepare them for KMT dominance, which is a very cartoonish way of looking at the incident, but you can't really blame Mr. Bloom when his source was a newspaper that cited this official government report that was heavily flawed to begin with. The fact that discussion of 228 was banned in Taiwan until martial law was lifted in 1987 meant that the boomer generation grew up not really reading much about it and only hearing bits and pieces at most from elders in this very hush-hush way. So in a way, the KMT gave the liberal opposition the opportunity to twist the narrative in a way that benefits them, because you got this generation of people that didn't really know what went on. And now we have generations of younger Taiwanese who are almost as misled as foreigners when it comes to the 228 incident. So if you look at the way separatists frame this issue, it's clear that they want descendants of 外省人 to feel collective guilt over the 228 incident. But if 外省人 should feel collective guilt over what the soldiers did, then why shouldn't 本省人 feel collective guilt for what local Taiwanese hooligans did during this tragedy? So starting in the 1990s, you had some 外省人 coming out and apologizing on behalf of all 外省人 for the 228 incident. And as a 外省人 on my father's side and 本省人 on my mom's side, I feel like I'm kind of in the middle, so I have the right to say this. I'm kind of thinking, what gives these people the right to apologize on my behalf? First off, I wasn't even born yet. Secondly, my paternal grandfather was from Shandong province, was a migrant worker in Korea when 228 happened. So why do I or my family have to carry the collective guilt of those of us in Taiwan with more recent ties to the mainland? If you think about it, the vast majority of 外省人 in Taiwan come from families that had absolutely nothing to do with 228. Because first off, most 外省人 did not arrive until 1949. And secondly, after 228, many mainlanders who were in Taiwan fled back to the mainland. But you don't hear about this part of the story when it's spoken of in the media. And the most disgusting part of this all is when these liberals talk about 228, they say, oh, it's to understand history so we can learn important lessons and forgive history while leaving the hatred in the past. But looking at how 228 is framed in the media every single year as these KMT mainlanders massacring innocent, poor, old, small Taiwanese people, do you really think the purpose is to get people here to forgive the past and heal from history's wounds? Or is it to sow division? Because regardless of how the riots began, regardless of the fact that 228 was started by a mainlander shooting a local Taiwanese, now you have riots spread throughout the island, northern Taiwan, central Taiwan, southern Taiwan, and at this point, it had to be stopped. So with all the violence going on here in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek's government on the mainland dispatched the 21st Division of the Army to suppress the violence, and on March 8th, reinforcements from the mainland arrived to Taiwan, landing in the northern port city of Keelung, better known in English as Keelung. This was the beginning of the third wave of killing and the part that actually gets talked about. So I'm not going to be speaking on it too much because we all know what happened, or you can easily find it online. Now, one thing about the 21st Division is a lot of the soldiers were illiterate peasants from Sichuan who had just fought a war against the Japanese. So when they heard that there were Taiwanese rioters murdering people with Japanese swords and expressing positive sentiments towards Japan, it riled up this hatred they had for Japanese people in them and made them want to avenge the deaths of mainlanders by the hands of people who were pro-Japanese. So this does explain why these soldiers sent from the mainland were so brutal. I'm not excusing them for murdering innocent people during this process, but it was basically war, and war's always a tragedy. So the 21st Division, they boarded their ship in Shanghai on March 7th, landed in Keelung on March 8th, and once they arrived, they immediately began shooting. But what often doesn't get mentioned is immediately upon arrival, they faced violent resistance from rioters. So it wasn't a massacre so much as it was a battle, because armed rioters were at the shore shooting at the soldiers. So of course the soldiers fired back. Then the soldiers began pushing southward, arriving to Taipei on March 9th, and then on to other cities, and they mowed down any resistance they faced. The reason why 228 gets framed as a massacre is because these soldiers were not particularly careful with this operation and would often open fire into crowds, raid homes, and conduct mass arrests. And this happened from northern Taiwan all the way to southern cities and towns like Kaohsiung and Jiayi. So in addition to rioters being killed, many innocent people who were at the wrong place at the wrong time were also killed. And I'm not justifying the actions of the 21st Division, but they were successful in ending the state of anarchy that ruled over Taiwan in the week before. And if we are going to be fair, if you are going to accuse these soldiers of killing indiscriminately, then we need to also address the fact that for over a week, local Taiwanese hooligans were slaughtering mainlanders indiscriminately as well. And so now we enter into the fourth wave of killings, which was a case of Taiwanese people using mainland soldiers to kill other Taiwanese people. So remember, the first wave was mainland cops and soldiers on Taiwanese civilians. The second wave was Taiwanese thugs on mainlander civilians. The third wave was mainland soldiers on Taiwanese people. And the fourth and final wave was Taiwanese people on Taiwanese people with the unwitting assistance from mainland soldiers. So as the military continued its campaign of repression, some local Taiwanese saw this as an opportunity to settle personal scores. Because the soldiers had just arrived from the mainland and were not familiar with Taiwan at all, and like I said, many were illiterate and not very sophisticated, to be honest, opportunistic local Taiwanese figured these soldiers didn't know who was who, and so they started feeding false information to soldiers, telling them that their own personal enemies or perhaps business competitors were anti-government rebels or communists. And because you had a bunch of soldiers who wanted to prove their effectiveness to their higher-ups, due process was not exactly a priority. So this phenomenon resulted in a lot of arrests, executions, and disappearances of innocent people. But how often is this spoken of today? Because once you know about this, again, the whole narrative of local Taiwanese being innocent victims while mainlanders being the sole evildoers over the course of 228 falls apart and is no longer convenient for the political aims of Taiwan separatists, because now you have documented proof of local Taiwanese killing innocent mainlanders, and you also have instances of local Taiwanese using clueless mainlanders to kill other local Taiwanese that they had beef with. This lasted all throughout March before the 228 incident eventually died down. So now that I've presented a fuller picture of the 228 incident, let's talk about the implications in Taiwan's politics today, starting with the death count. So in 1995, the 228 Memorial Foundation was set up to compensate and rehabilitate the victims of 228. The application period lasted until 2017, so 22 years, and there was a maximum payout of 6 million new Taiwan dollars if you could prove that you lost a family member during the months of the 228 incident. Basically, it was 6 million if you could provide some evidence of death, and less if you could prove disappearance or wrongful imprisonment and stuff of that nature. Now, I need to remind everyone that Taiwan's household registration system was very complete because the government inherited it from the Japanese colonial government, which was extremely systematic about keeping those sorts of records. So any deaths or disappearances could easily be proven. In no city or county were there records of thousands of people dying during February or March of 1947. So this makes the 28,000 figure very questionable. And by this, I mean if we count all deaths as 228 deaths, including like some guy falling off a cliff. Like the numbers we get don't add up. And with the maximum payout of 6 million new Taiwan dollars, which is about 180,000 US dollars, I don't know about you, but if someone in my family died in 228, I would apply in a heartbeat. But let's look at how many cases were submitted. So from 1995 to 2017, 2,792 cases were approved, 685 of them being for deaths, 180 of them for disappearances, and 1,437 of them for other cases such as imprisonment, injury, or reputational damage. I don't know about you, but if 18,000 to 28,000 people died, you'd think there'd be more than 685 families trying to get reparations, wouldn't you? Now, if you assume that disappearances were also deaths, then that's a total of 865 local Taiwanese deaths at the hands of KMT soldiers. And in case you're wondering, I got these figures directly from their website at 228.org.tw. If you don't believe me, just copy and paste the Chinese introduction into ChatGPT and ask it to translate it into English. Isn't it curious how known Taiwan separatist sympathizer George Kerr only cited 10,000 deaths? That's still a lot lower than 28,000 or 18,000. And then a Nanjing-based delegation cited 3,000 to 4,000 in the immediate aftermath of the 228 incident. Now, even if there were 3,000 deaths, you'd expect more than 865 families trying to get their 6 million new Taiwan dollars, right? I'm not saying that there were only 865 deaths, but a more realistic estimate was probably in like the thousands to 2,000s. Now, more ridiculous was Japan-based Taiwan separatist Kim Bire, that's her Japanese name, Jin Meiling in Chinese. She is a Taiwan-born separatist who lived in exile in Japan during martial law before eventually renouncing her Taiwan citizenship in favor of becoming a Japanese citizen. She wrote a book called 日本啊, Taiwan啊. So in English, it's something like, oh, Japan, oh, Taiwan. What's really funny is, in the beginning of her book, she said 28,000 died during 228. But later on in the same book, she wrote 50,000. Others have claimed crazy death tolls like 100,000 that are just completely divorced from reality. I don't know about you, but I think that the 18,000 to 28,000 figure provided by the Li Denghui administration was completely bogus, especially considering how their report downplayed 本省人 on 外省人 violence and heavily scrutinized 外省人 on 本省人 killings. So there's clearly political motivation to paint the event a certain way. And an increased death toll would better sell the story of, oh, poor Taiwanese brutally terrorized by mean mainlanders. And if this is the case, then tell me, is this restorative justice? Or is it political opportunists trying to sell a sob story to create a Taiwanese versus mainlander atmosphere? Of course, 外省人 who arrived to Taiwan in the 1940s and stayed here have since fully integrated into Taiwan society, and the lines are blurred now between the two broad groups of people on this island. But you can still sell the story that these soldiers were brutal killers because they were mainlanders, and the CPC is in charge of the mainland today, and they're mainlanders, so therefore the Communist Party of China is also a bunch of brutal murderers. The story they're selling is Taiwan was a poor victim of mainland brutality, or as they like to frame it, Chinese brutality, to imply the two sides are separate. However, those oppressors during 228 have since integrated into our society, and we've learned to forgive and move on. Now, this completely flies in the face of a much more complicated reality, but if we accept this as the truth, then why does 228 even need to be constantly mentioned every year? Like, why do they need to lie so much about the 228 incident? And the reason is, it's to sell the idea that ever since 1947, Taiwan's been consistently fucked by Chinese mainlanders, first by the KMT and now by the CPC apparently depriving Taiwan its room to shine on the world stage, so as they say. These mainlanders killed a gajillion people here on Taiwan, and now mainlanders today are supposedly doing this and that in Xinjiang and Tibet. I'm not saying that it's any better that the death toll was much lower than we're told, But if we ask ourselves why it's being inflated so much and how come certain killings are exaggerated while others are significantly downplayed, we can see how disgusting the people pushing this particular narrative are. Not only do they present the 228 incident as the wholesale slaughter of Taiwanese people by KMT mainlanders, but they also frame the entirety of the KMT's White Terror in this way. And they try to imply that the victims of White Terror were a bunch of Taiwan independence fighters. However, while Taiwan separatists were in fact thrown in jail at the time, the main targets of White Terror were communists and suspected communists, who were more often than not mainlanders, so 外省人, and not local Taiwanese or 本省人. So the idea that White Terror was the simple matter of mainlanders killing Taiwanese is also nonsense, since if we look at the statistics, more mainlanders in Taiwan were executed for political crimes than Taiwanese people were. These separatists like to turn Taiwan's history into the sob story, and then they'll point fingers at descendants of mainlanders in Taiwan, asking, how many 本省人 have you 外省人 killed? But if we're going to play this game, it'd only be fair if we ask 本省人 how many 外省人 they've killed. You look at the tragedy that is the 228 incident. If we're to seriously answer this question for the 228 incident, the number of mainlanders and local Taiwanese killed were roughly the same. And if we're gonna characterize the military suppression of the chaos as a massacre, then it's only fair that we also consider the merciless and indiscriminate killing of mainlanders by local Taiwanese as a massacre as well. I felt the need to create this episode as we approach the 78th anniversary of the 228 incident because due to the lack of information in English, a lot of the separatist narrative is just taken as fact and even repeated by self-described pro-China commentators who don't realize they're repeating DPP propaganda designed to sow division not just between Taiwan and the mainland, but also within Taiwan itself. And because of these lies and also the way limited information is being translated, all of a sudden we have a fake genocide that never happened because people think that the 228 incident was the wholesale slaughter of indigenous people in Taiwan by the Han people sent by the KMT, when the reality was this incident was different groups of Han people killing each other under very fucked up circumstances. I don't feel the need to defend the KMT, nor do I feel inclined to defend the local Taiwanese lumpen proletariat who terrorized mainlanders on this island. But what I will defend is the truth, and hopefully from this episode, you'll understand how easy it is for lies to build on top of one another and then spread like wildfire, oftentimes at the hands of people who mean well. So I think that's everything I wanted to cover. If you have any questions about the 228 incident or anything else, or if you got anything else you'd like to add, please leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube. And if you see someone talking about how the KMT committed a genocide against Taiwan's indigenous population, show him or her this video or link the Substack article so we can make the truth more widespread. As always, if you've got any feedback or show suggestions, feel free to send me an email at straighttalk@xiangyu.tw. And if you want to support me in sharing perspectives of this part of the world not typically covered by Western mainstream media, please be sure to share my content as well as subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. For those who really enjoy the work I do and want to give more support, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon, becoming a member of this YouTube channel, or making a one-time donation to any of the links down below in the show notes. I'd now like to give a huge shout out to my upper level patrons, Alvin Jia, Wang Yijing, Michael Kim, Victor, CD14039, Jim Fox, Cabasa de Fogo, SCY, and Maddie Roxy. Thank you so much for going above and beyond to keep the show going and allow me to dedicate time to pursuing this passion project. Thank you all for tuning in, and as always, see you guys in the next episode.